Welcome back. So continuing where we left off, after adding all of our assets to our environment, we are now going to turn them into interactable objects and behaviors through the scenario flow. In order to get to the scenario flow, just look up here and click the scenario flow tab. Now, in the scenario flow tab, when you are here, you should see this. You can zoom, let me add a state so you can see this more clearly. You can zoom in and out, and you can pan your view by middle clicking with your middle mouse wheel and dragging the canvas along, or switching to the hand tool so you can left click and move it around when you're doing that. You can delete any added states or transitions by going to the delete tool and clicking the X in the upper right hand corner. Quickly going back to the selection tool, I'm going to go here and I'm going to drop a new state. Now, within the scenario flow, you are able to create a flowchart like layout of the behaviors in your simulation. So without writing a single line of code, you're going to be able to develop, deploy, and generate the behaviors and instructions that you want for your user to go through. In order to do this, all of these actions are going to be contained between states and transitions. Let's start with creating states. In order to create a state, you can click the button here to add a state, which will create it, and when you left click, it'll go from new state and to the next one in the sequence. You can also right click to add a state or a transition where you're clicked, click and drag and drop. Now, states by default come in with the names 0 through however many states you make. If you would like to rename them, and we do recommend that, you can click them here in the top bar to rename them. I'm going to take my state 0 and rename it to Introduction. Now, before we move too much further forward, I want to point out that when a state is selected, it'll be outlined in blue. An unselected state will have this little gray outline. And your entry state will have this thicker white background or border. The entry state is the one that can be set here by this entry state dropdown. You can see our introduction and state 1 and state 2 states. What this means is, if I went through my simulation, this is the state where it would begin. And based off of the configuration of the transitions and other things like that, it may or may not come to this state if I changed how it is. Currently, as introduction is alone and is not connected to state 1 or state 2, there would be no method for introduction to reach either of these. In order to have this connection occur, you would use this transition button. So you can either click here and it will tell you to select the origin, so we'll select our first state, and then select the destination. This will automatically create this connection point between them, which I can drag and manipulate around. If I were to add a behavior, such as collide, it will automatically populate. However, if I want to give information about it, or change this name from its default of just outlining what is occurring there, I can give this a name by clicking here. And let's just go with example name. You can see here, it will replace this trigger name of collide or collision to whatever I type in here. I can delete the name and the state by clicking, or the transition by clicking there, or by going to the trash tool and clicking the X or delete tool. So if I were to create another one, I can do this. And you can see there's an X on this. I can also right click on a node and either copy it, rename it, select it, or add a transition, which will automatically select the node or the state I right clicked and switch it to the destination selection picker. So I can do this. And you can also right click on these to change the origin, the destination, or delete it. So with that, let's get to actually populating these states. So I have my introduction state, and we're going to start adding behaviors here. So I'm going to select my state, and I can see here introduction is the one I've currently selected. If I selected state 1, not only do I see the blue outline, but I can see the name of the state here. Okay, and we want to make sure that we are selected on entry actions. And we're going to hit this drop down here and go to display message. And after we've selected our action here, we're going to click Create. Now, let's just pause for a moment and look at this. On the introduction node, we see a little green indicator here, and the type of display message, and this little button here. If I had multiples of these, I could reorganize the order of these by either clicking and dragging here. In fact, let's add some more now so we can showcase that feature. So clicking that drop down, we're going to click Highlight, and we're going to create 2 highlight actions. Now, we can see here, I can click and drag this to rearrange these, and you can see the highlight is now at the top. If I want, I can also do so by clicking here on this button to move an action up. If I've accidentally made a third highlight, I can go down, and I can delete this by clicking the X button here. Okay. So with this, you can see that we are working on these entry actions. Entry actions, or the enter ones, will have this green little nodule indicated here, and will happen when you first enter a state. This is as opposed to exit actions. So when I click this button here, I can be looking at the entry actions. When I'm clicking here, I'm looking at the exit ones. If I create a state here, you can see here it shows up at the bottom of my list and has a little red indicator on the right. This indicates that this will happen when you leave a state action. We're going to want 2 highlights here for this. Do keep in mind what each of these are, and do be careful about managing how you have set these up. Okay, so let's move on to the display message. Display messages are typically used to display text to users or give instructions from the system itself. You're able to type in whatever message you would like, and you have different areas where you can type them in. So here in the header, I'm going to put in introduction. In the message, I'm going to type in a welcome message, inviting people to our virtual chemistry lab where they'll be exploring and learning about the flames test. Before we begin, wear gloves and safety glasses. And for the button text, by default, I believe it says OK. I'm going to change this to I understand. And by adjusting all of these, you are able to change what are the properties of the display message. Now, display messages have a few different parts that can be done. Wait until finished means that the user must acknowledge this display message. In this case, they must hit the button before they can move on. If you have this deselected, this message could be in the environment and does not need to be engaged with. If it doesn't need to be engaged with, you can remove the button so that it will not have the option to be dismissed by the user. Okay, but in our case, we're going to keep this here. Next is the placement. You can have it anchored, which on desktop is going to have it take up the center of the screen by the user so that they must dismiss it before it will go away. Whereas in virtual reality and other platforms, it may be put into a different location. On VR, for example, it will be attached to the player's left controller. The other option is in space, in which case you can type in a coordinate position, and within the scene layout, it would show up at that location. As an example, if I were to put it in the 000 position, which is the default, this is where our display message would appear, which is not where we would want it. As such, I'm going to keep it anchored for this instance. But there are times where you may want to put it in space at a specific position, orientation, and scale within your environment. Lastly are the display types. You can have your display message displayed, which means that you'll just get a text box showing what it is that it looks like with this information. You could have it be spoken by the system, and you can select a voice to do so using text-to-speech, or you can upload your own audio and have it play that instead. If you are going to use this, it will only read out the message component, and it must be under a 400 character limit. Lastly, you can have it be displayed and spoken. meaning that you will get a text box with this information and the button, as well as have it be spoken by your selected voice. In our case, let's just do display only for this one, shall we? Next, for the highlights. Highlighting is typically very useful for indicating to users what it is you would like them to interact with. In our case, we're going to have them begin by wearing the gloves and safety glasses. So we're going to highlight the blue safety glasses and the gloves. So currently, these will not highlight because we've identified the objects, but we haven't told it to highlight the objects. In order to turn the highlight on, select these two buttons. Next, moving on to the exit state actions, we're going to take these two highlight actions and we're going to unhighlight the safety glasses and the work gloves. So this way, when we leave this state, both of them will be unhighlighted. And this is done here. So it's the same finding of the objects as we did before, but rather than it being checked, we will uncheck it, which will unhighlight them. And that is how we would set up our first state. Next, let's demonstrate branching within our simulation here. So, much like with any flowchart, you are able to branch or have two different locations where a user is able to reach coming out of one. So by adding this condition here, you're able to have the actions set up to where the user is either going up top or down below. This is because while we want the user to be able to wear both the gloves and the safety glasses, we don't really care to enforce the order. And by doing it this way, we'll be able to see whether they used the gloves first or whether they used the glasses first. Okay. Now, going through this simulation, there's not going to be any difference in behavior. If we want to take note of an action by the user to be either displayed later or something to be captured within our logs, which we can then review, we are going to want to add a feedback log. We do this by getting the drop-down, taking the first action of add feedback log, and creating it. Now, the add feedback log has three different feedback panels that you can feed this information to. Either the performance notes, which we'll be using here, utterance scoring, or formative feedback. Just keep in mind whatever you add the feedback log with is the one that it will go to. So in this case, for adding feedback log, we're just going to say you used the gloves first. And for this one, you used the glasses first. Now, currently, we're going to leave these transitions empty, but we'll come back to those later. Just know that these are now connected so that if I went to introduction, it would, at this moment, go from introduction to use gloves first, and it would never do use glasses first because we haven't put in a transition trigger here. When we come back, that will be handled and managed here. But let's move forward, shall we? So after using the gloves first, we're going to create a new transition asking the user to turn on the Bunsen burner. Is what this one's going to be. So turn on Bunsen burner. Because after they've put on their proper PPE of the gloves and the safety glasses, we want them to be able to do so. Okay, so first, before we go here, we're going to give them a nice little sound, letting them know that they did a good job. We're going to click this create button to play an audio of a bell chime. Now the volume can be set between 0 and 1, so 0.5 is perfectly fine, but we're just going to do a full volume bell chime. You can add a delay to the sound, and if you want to preview whatever sound you selected, click this here and it should play. It can either be global, which means that the sound is just going to be heard by the user no matter where they're at, or it can be centered around a virtual object in your environment. And in which case you would hit this drop down to select which object is emanating the sound. It is necessary to have it be emanating from a virtual object if you want the sound to be played in a spatial manner, meaning that those who are near the object will be able to hear it and those that are far away would not, or they would hear it quieter depending on your settings. In this case, though, we're going to keep it with global. Lastly, we have the option to wait until the audio is finished, which means that the state actions will not move forward or execute until after the sound is finished playing. If this is deselected, the audio will play and it will immediately move into the next action. In this case, we're going to keep this selected here. Next, we're going to do a display message again. This time, we're going to tell them to use the Bunsen burner to light up the burner. Turn on Bunsen burner is the name of our header, and we're going to leave our text the same. And we're going to leave all of this as its default. Okay, let's move forward to our next action. Now for this one, we're going to instruct them to grab the spatula. Okay, so in this one, we've had them introduce to the scenario. We've taken note whether they've used their gloves first or the glasses. They're going to use the opposite of whichever one they did here. And they're going to use the Bunsen burner here. After which point, having turned on the Bunsen burner, we're now going to want to have our flames be visible. The first one, the default flame, burner flame default that we set here. So with that, as it starts not visible, we're going to want to change its visible attribute. To adjust an attribute, you want to use the set attribute action. So let's create one of those. Let's find our virtual object type. We're going to look for our burner flame default. We're going to go to this drop down, and you can see that these are the default properties of the object that you can adjust here. And we're going to look for visibility. And we want it to change from its concrete value from false to true. So with this, the object will be made visible. Because they did such a good job again, we're going to play an audio noise of a bell chime. Again, make sure the volume is 1. And we're going to make it so that the spatula is grabbable at this point. Okay, so let's just quickly look at our spatula here. You can see it is not grabbable at this point of the simulation, and this is intentional. We are limiting the available interactions of the user until it is appropriate for them to do so. This way, they can't get distracted by interacting with other objects until they are able to move forward. If you want this to be different, you can absolutely adjust this within your simulation. So, again, in the same way we did the change in visibility for the flame, we're going to adjust the ability to grab it, or the spatula. So let's select virtual object, scroll down, and look for our chemistry spatula. There it is. Go to this drop down and look for the grabbable option. Please keep in mind that there's a difference between grabbed and grabbable. Grabbable is what you want here, which is the ability for it to be grabbed. Grabbed indicates whether it is currently held by the user. As such, when we do grabbable, they can now grab the spatula. And now that they are able to do so, this is where we're going to want to give them the display message asking them to grab the spatula. And in this case, we're going to leave the header and button text blank so you can see how those are different, or what happens if you leave them empty. All right. Next, we're going to have the user gather the sample. Because they now have the spatula in their hand, presumably, we're going to have them gather the sample. So, like many things, we're going to start by playing a bell chime. And then we are going to give them the message asking them to collide the spatula with the sample that they want to test. and give the header of gather any sample. All right, and now we're going to add an exit state action here to change this, because when they gather a sample successfully, we want them to be able to see that they have something at the tip of their spatula. So in this case, we're going to select virtual object, look for our white cylinder here, and change its visible property to true. Going back to the entry actions, again, so they've turned on the Bunsen burner, they're grabbing the spatula, they're going to gather a sample, and depending on which of the 3 samples they gather, they're going to get a different behavior when they burn it. But regardless, we want them to visualize it, so we are making it so that the white cylinder that is representing the sample that they have taken on the end of their spoon, or spatula. Next, we're going to create a few interactions here. So for this one, we are going to have them gather strontium, which is our first sample. So here, all we need is display message. Okay, now we're going to copy this and make a second one. This one is going to be gather copper. The message for this is the same though, as regardless of what sample that they've gathered, we do not need to change the message telling them to do differently. Because regardless of which one they gather, we want them to then take that sample and put it into the Bunsen burner flame. The last of our samples is potassium. Alright, so at this we have made 3 interactions here that are going through this. Now, these will eventually transition into burning the samples. So, I'm going to quickly put this here. So call this one burn sample 1. So for this, we're going to want to do the following. We're going to go to the set attribute action. We're going to look for the red flame, because when strontium is burned, it will cause the excitation to make it so that the flame will appear red. After making the red flame visible, we want to hide our default flame. So we're going to go to this one. We're going to change its visibility property to false. Okay. Now at this point, we're going to want to have our virtual person be the one to be speaking to us. So, if you want a virtual person to be speaking, like this Dr. Arnold that we've put into our scenario, rather than using a display message, you would switch it to a speak action. So, for the speak action, you would scroll down here and find speak and hit create. Now this is very similar to a display message, but it requires, in order for this to function, you just select a virtual person, in this case Dr. Arnold. You can again upload your audio or do a text-to-speech pattern, and select a voice. In this case I'm going to go with Justin. I'm going to go with an animation type of none, but you can set it as random or select from any of the animations we have within here. Okay, and I'm going to want him to wait until he's finished speaking before it to move forward. Now, the information for strontium is the following. Strontium gives crimson red color in the flame test. It is due to the excitation of electrons by the thermal energy, which is then followed by de-excitation of electrons to ground state along with the liberation of light in the visible range. Thus, why it burns red. After that, we are going to set the attributes of our flames back to what they were. So, again, we're going to find our default flame, and we're going to make it visible, making sure that's true. And once more, going to the drop-down, and we're going to take our red flame, change its visibility to false. Okay, and that will have us control our burning of sample 1. I'm going to now copy this, and for the copper, I'm just going to change this from burn sample 1 to burn sample 2. And a lot of this is going to be the same, except for rather than a red flame, like we did with strontium, we're going to do a yellow-green flame, because that's what color copper burns when you burn it. So hit the drop down, find it and make it visible, scroll down, change what was red to yellow-green, visibility to false, and let's give the information about copper burning, which is the halogen present in the compound reacts with copper to form a volatile copper halide, which imparts a blue or green color to the flame. And last, let's copy this for one more time. Call this burn sample 3. Again, rather than our yellow-green flame, potassium burns purple. So we're going to make it so that is what we are adjusting here. Changing the visibilities as necessary, and giving the information about potassium. So potassium is colorless or in white, but when it is heated, produces a violet flame due to the excitation of the electrons to the higher energy orbitals. Potassium burns with a light purple colored flame. Alright, so with this, all of this will be complete, and we're going to create a few more transitions here. After you have burned your samples, regardless, you're going to want to clean the spatula. Okay, because after you've done so, you want it to be, or you want to make sure that there's no other components present on it so that when you clean it, and before gathering another sample, it's not going to burn some other color you weren't expecting. So, we're going to add a display message again. This time, instructing them to, before gathering another sample, it's important to clean your spatula with hydrochloric acid, or HCl, and instructing them to do so now. Okay, and we are going to highlight our clear liquid here when they do so. That way they know when we're saying hydrochloric acid, this is what we're referring to. And when they have done so or have utilized it, we want to unhighlight the hydrochloric acid. Alright, so with that, we've laid these out. Let's add in the last of our state actions. So here, we're going to make a quiz here. And a quiz can be added at any point in your simulation using the quiz feature. You can have it be multiple choice or a single choice kind of quiz. Difference being multiple selections could be correct, such as like if you have an A, B, C, D selection, A and B could be correct, or B and C could be correct, or it could still just be just D if you wanted. Or single choice, where they can only make a single selection, like just A, just B, just C, or just D. It is your choice. In this case, we're going to create a question here. There is a quiz header, so Tollin's flame test. Enter the question here of after going through this simulation, what color do you think strontium would burn? And we can give them their answers of red, which is correct, yellow, blue, green, or purple. And if you hit save, you can see here it's present. If you select spoken, it will speak out the quiz, and you can have this anchored or in space, the same way you can with a the same way that you can with a display message. We're going to go here and here, branching it again, going got the quiz question correct, and got the quiz question incorrect, because we're going to branch these two based off of what they did. We're going to add a feedback log of each. Strunt quiz question correct, quiz question incorrect. And we're going to add a display message here telling them, hey, great job, that's correct. On the other hand, I'm sorry, that's incorrect. As a reminder, strontium was one of the samples we burned, and it burned red when introduced to the flame. Okay? And last, we're going to give our final display message of this concludes our simulation. And now we are going to show the feedback log that we set up before, which is now going to have two pieces of information, which is what interaction that they chose at the beginning with the glasses, and whether or not they got the quiz question correct. Okay? So, with this, we have done pretty much everything except for adding a custom condition to, or a customizable attribute to, one of our assets. So let's do so now. So you are able to add customizable attributes outside of these default ones. These are typically used for keeping track of data or things that are just not thought to have been or not common between every asset. You're able to select an asset and click this customizable button here, and then you'll see this button to create a custom attribute. So in our case, I'm going to do so for this one here, which is, as a reminder, this sample. And to make it so it's much more easy for me to keep track, I'm going to go name this the strontium beaker. I'm going to name this one the copper beaker. I'm going to label this one the potassium beaker. And I'm just doing this so that I can better keep track of each. Okay, and I'm going to create a custom attribute of this called test sample 1 taken. And I'm going to make this a boolean of a true false type, and initially it's going to be false. Okay, for our next one, I'm going to add a custom attribute. This one I'm going to call test sample 2 taken, and it's also going to be a boolean. And lastly, this is going to be test sample 3 taken, which is also going to be a boolean, which is initially going to be set to false. And the reason we are doing this is we are going to make it so that in our scenario flow here, the user is going to be looping through all of these until eventually they have taken all of their samples, at which point, rather than being asked to clean the spatula, it will move them forward into the quiz and have it going so there. So, with this, let's move forward, shall we? And finish creating these connections or transitions between each of these. So back to our introduction of using the gloves first. And in order to set this up, we're going to have this transition by using a use trigger. So quickly looking at this, we're going to select this action. We're going to look at these transitions here, and we're going to name this one use use gloves. You can see here, if I click this drop down, I go to use, I click this, it'll populate. I'm going to hit, I can either type in here, look for gloves, or if I want to, I can hit this here, which will show me all the objects. Now, when using an object, there's able to be selecting either virtual objects or virtual object groups, which I cover in a different video. Use category has to do with whether you want them to use any part of the object or a specific location on an object with the hitbox. In this case, we want them to be able to click on anywhere on the gloves. You can make it so that the object can only be used if it is currently held, which is not what we want in this case. You can give a text box indicator, which means that these are highlights over the interactable object in question. There will be a text box saying you can left click on it or pull the trigger if it's in VR. I'm going to disable that. And if they're highlighting over it, or if they're hovering over it, there will be a highlight over the object in question. So in that case, this is the configuration I want for using the gloves. For using the glasses, which is the other one we're going to do, we're going to click here, find our glasses, which I'm going to do by scrolling this time. We find our blue safety glasses. Okay, so you can see here, if it's just use, it keeps it like that. Whereas I would rather have it be use safety glasses. Okay, and I personally like to do this so it tells me not only the action, but what object they are using to move forward. Now let's collapse these back down to the Bunsen burner. And we're going to do the inverse of what they did before. So in this case, they've already used the glasses down here. So we're going to have them use the gloves. And in this one, they've already used the gloves, so this time they're going to have them use the glasses. I'm just going to copy these names here. And there we go. Next, we're turning on the Bunsen burner to grabbing the spatula. Again, we're telling them to use the Bunsen burner to light up the burner. So we're going to have them use the Bunsen burner. In this case, I'm going to rename it to use Bunsen burner. So these are our immediate use actions. Next, between grabbing the spatula and gathering the sample, we're going to add another transition. And in this case, rather than the use interaction, we're going to have it be a grab interaction. So let's hit the drop down and go to grab. Here you can see that there's this interaction here where you can either again grab a virtual object or virtual object group and the entity you want them to grab. In this case, we are looking for them to grab the chemistry spatula. I'm just going to quickly grab spatula. Okay, so with this, when the user has grabbed the object that we are indicating, it will move forward. Whereas in these ones, it will move forward only when they've used the object in question. Now, for gathering a sample, we're allowing them to gather it from any of these. So we're going to connect this to 3 different branches. But all of these are going to have the same kind of transition, which is going to be a collide interaction. So a collide interaction is looking for it to either start or end, meaning when a collision begins, when you have pushed an object into another, or when it's gone away, or is no longer colliding with an object. In our case, we want this to occur when the collide start action occurs. In order for a collision to happen, you need to define 2 objects. Again, you can either select a virtual object or virtual object group, which I go over more in a different video. So let's select our 2 objects here. In this case, it is going to be our chemistry spatula and the first beaker, or I should say, our second beaker, because our first one is containing our HCl, which I'll name here. Our second beaker is containing our strontium. This one we're going to do the same between our spatula and our beaker. And lastly, our chemistry spatula and our final beaker. Okay, I'm just going to call this collide spatula with beaker 2, 3, and 4. Alright, moving through here, all of these are connected as such. And in this case, these are going to be colliding the chemistry spatula with the Bunsen burner. Chemistry spatula with the Bunsen burner. So by doing it this way, we are taking we are gathering our samples, of which these 3 they can choose. Once they've done so, when they collide it with the burner, it will then burn the sample, having it be whatever color is appropriate based off of these settings. Okay, and I'm just going to quickly name these collide spatula with Bunsen burner. Go through here and here. All of these would then connect with the clean the spatula action. And in this case, we don't actually need any condition here, because after it's burned, we're always going to want them to clean the sample here. Okay, now at this point, we want it to connect from here all the way back to where we have them gather the sample again. So we're going to quickly go here. And in this case, we need one last collide action to clean it. In this case, the chemistry spatula colliding with the first beaker, which has our HCl. So, collide spatula with beaker 1. Okay. Now, with this, we've got a nice little loop going with all of our actions here, and it eventually wrapping back around. But we would be in an infinite loop here. In order to get it out, we would want a transition here. Now, I've been showing you triggers up to this point, which is looking for one type of interaction, of which there is a large list of them. Again, if you have any questions about any of these, you can refer to our documentation. But in this case, I want it to move forward after you have gathered the samples from each of these. So in order to do that, we're going to need to leverage conditions. So we're going to create a condition here. All you do is go to the Conditions tab. You can see here it has changed here. And by the way, it is entirely possible to have a trigger and conditions in the same time, but in this case, we're only using the condition. Now the condition we want is going to be based off of the virtual object that we did before. In this case, we want to make sure that test sample 1 has been taken. And we're going to do that for all 3 of our samples. So test sample 1 taken, test sample 2 taken, and test sample 3 taken all need to be true in order for us to move forward into this quiz section. Okay? So with this, it will only occur after the user has gone through each of these once. But we have not yet made it so that these attributes that we've put in are included in our simulation. So we would need to go back here at this point and add that set attribute to each of these. So I'm going to go to this drop-down, create a new attribute, find our beaker, and test sample 1 taken will now be set to true. We're going to do the same here, except for this time. Going to do this. Test sample 2 taken is true. And test sample 3 taken is true. So with this, after they have gone through all 3 interactions here, they will then have this condition be set to true because they would have gotten through all 3. Based off of our setup, they could burn copper or strontium 20 times and not have burned potassium at all, but only once they have done so will it let them move forward. Next, for our quiz interactions here, we want it to go up if they get the question right and down if they get the question wrong. You can trigger this by looking at the simulation condition, hitting the drop-down, and looking for the question type. Now, we only have one question, so this question of 0 is the only one there, so not to worry. And correct is going up top. And here, if I go to question, I go correct is equal to false, will it then go down here. I would also recommend making it so that you are labeling these as appropriate. So this one will be gathered all 3 samples. Quiz, question, correct. Quiz, question, incorrect. Okay, now, I did mention that this entity of question 0 here, if you have multiple quizzes, this may be important to you. In order to find your question ID, if you expand your choices, you can see it listed here. These are created in the order that you create the quizzes, and you can reference these at any time by clicking that Expand Choices button. Okay. And lastly, let's add a final transition here between each of these. I think it's fine if these are empty. We're going to call this conclusion. So with that, we have finished authoring our simulation with all of these components. If you want, you are able to experience this now. I would recommend saving. And you can experience your simulation by hitting save here, or do a quick launch by saving and playing your simulation by clicking this button here. So with that, I will cover in the next video how to preview and test your simulation, as well as the results of what we have built thus far. Thank you.